Hey folks, welcome back for another segment on analytics for decision making. In this segment, we're going to pick up roughly where we left off from the last, and we're going to now take a look at a slightly more involved example to think about using some decision tree analysis to model a choice under uncertainty, and then to also think about this issue of deriving the option value of that piece of information by applying that three-step process that we had seen in the last segment. So jumping right into it, and our next example, and we're going to think about the fundamental uncertainty faced when thinking about the decision of an oil drilling production company. And there is significant risk involved in setting up shop and drilling in any given potential drill site, which can either have oil in it, which we're going to assume is a binary trade, even though the reality is that it's really continuous. But we'll assume that a potential drill site can either be dry, meaning it does not have any oil, or it is a wet site, meaning it does have oil. Wet wells are considered a success, whereas dry wells are considered failures. And we're going to assume here that prior to drilling, a well state cannot be observed at the time at which we have to commit to investing in a drill site, meaning we need to make our decision prior to knowing whether or not a given drill site is good or bad. Okay, and we're going to think about now the decision really of whether or not there's oil in the ground at any given site, not being chosen by us, but really being determined by nature, by a stochastic process where nature decides the relative frequency with which we're going to find wet versus dry wells. Okay, now in terms of some economics here, okay, we are given some historical data on the past frequency of success and failure, in that we are given information on the past 100 randomly selected sites, which yielded 20 successes, 20 wet wells, and 80 failures. And we should be able to hopefully pretty easily apply here the relative frequency approach using the distribution of wet and dry events as is given to us in our data set. So we know there's a total of 100 days, 20 of them are wet, which means we have 20 out of 100, implying the probability of a successful well being 1/5, whereas the probability of hitting a dry well, a failure, will be the remaining 4/5. And we can now associate those unconditional probabilities along the appropriate branches of our diagram. Okay, now, as we mentioned, we only really face this uncertainty if we've chosen to invest in a given drill site. And the cost of drilling, which must be sunk before observing the realization of the state of nature, whether or not there's oil in the ground, let's suppose is $5 million. Cost me $5 million up front. I don't get that back, even if I don't strike oil. To simplify our analysis, let's suppose that the net discounted present value of a wet well yields a lifetime value of $35 million. And we'll assume that's all discounted back to present value terms today. So there's no issue with time value, interest rates, that sort of thing to contend with in this example. And otherwise, we're going to assume here that a dry well yields a revenue of 0. Meaning, if we do hit a wet well and we make 35 million in revenues, but it costs us 5, right, in sunk investment cost. So our payoff at the top decision branch there, the end leaf of that top branch, rather, not our decision branch, nature's choice, is going to be 30 million profit. However, if it is a dry well and we've made that investment, then we just lose our $5 million investment. We make a $5 million profit loss. So here's the economics of the situation, in addition to our data, right, our relative frequency data, which gave us information regarding the associated probabilities of showing up on one branch or the other of our very small tree diagram thus far. We're going to consider a simple binary decision here of whether or not to invest in the drill site given this ex ante uncertainty of nature. Again, ex ante meaning we have to make the decision before we know whether or not there's oil in the ground. So if you think about the timing in this diagram going from left to right, then the point at which we have to make a decision is going to be backwards in time. And again, we can choose to invest. And if we go that route, right, then we face nature's choice. But we could choose to not invest if we thought it was business savvy not to do that. And if we don't invest, then we don't sink the cost, we don't get the revenues. So our payoff in this situation would then be zero. Okay, take a moment and notice the difference between our decision node where we actually have to specify an action versus nature's choice where there is no action being specified. That's just a random outcome, a stochastic outcome governed by nature. So our three-step process of deriving option value, which we looked at in the previous segment, first had us consider what was the payoff to the decision maker in the absence of any information. And we'll wrap that up in this segment. In the segments to follow, we'll focus on how to approach finding the payoff to the individual if they were using some additional information, if they had some signal about the quality of a given drill site, which we're going to talk about in future segments. But for the moment, this is the only thing we know. We've drilled 100 times randomly in the past. We were successful 20% of the time, 1/5 of those, right? But the other 4/5 were failures. That's the only thing we know at this point. We don't have any other information. So what we want to do here is compute the expected payoff resulting from either decision and compare, right? What's the optimal action for us to take in the absence of any information? And if we were to choose the action of investing, meaning we're now on the top part of the tree, okay, that means then we face nature's uncertainty. We face that 1/5, 4/5 lottery, if you will, between a payoff of 30 million and a payoff of -5 million. So if we were to invest, right, then we just have to calculate the probability weighted average, right, the expected profit across those two situations. So 1/5 of the time, we get a payoff of 30 mil. The other 4/5, we get a payoff of -5 mil. And if you're very careful with your arithmetic there, you should see that the expected payoff, the profit of this operation, of this oil drilling operation with no additional information, and only knowing the historical pattern of successes and failures, comes out to $2 million. And to think about, well, what's the optimal action? We have to compare that to the alternate action we could take, which is not drilling. And if we opted not to drill, okay, the math is easy here. Then we, engender a certain payoff with certitude of $0. So the logic here hopefully is pretty reasonable because 2 million is bigger than 0. We take the blue action and we're willing to face that risk as opposed to the red action, which gets us out of that. Therefore, the optimal action without any additional information is to invest in the drill site, and the expected payoff that we make without any additional information winds up being this $2 million gain, okay, on average, in expectation, right? 1/5 of the time we're successful, 4/5 we're not, but on average, we come out 2 million ahead relative to not investing. So the optimal action at that decision node is for us to invest. Okay. That about wraps up this segment. In the next segments to come, we're going to look at if we had additional information. For example, if we could hire a geologist who can run a test in the ground and tell us whether or not a drill site is good or bad. We'll think about how can we derive the option value of the geologist's signal, of the geologist's report, right? How valuable is that knowledge? And we'll think about that for different qualities of that report. For the smartest geologist you can have, who's always right, versus a geologist that maybe provides an imperfect signal as to whether or not there is oil in a given drill site. And that's what we will pick up with next segment. See you then.